Today, we're going to dive into a really fascinating and, pretty provocative book from 1986. It's Michael Parenti's Inventing Reality. And even though it was written decades ago, its ideas about the politics of mass media are still a huge part of the conversation today. So let's just start with a really basic question. Think about it. When you imagine what's happening in another city or on the other side of the planet, where does that picture in your head actually come from? Well, for pretty much all of us, it comes from the news. And it's that picture-making process that Parenti's book really wants us to take a closer look at. So here's how we're going to break down Parenti's argument in this explainer. We'll kick things off with his main idea, this concept of inventing reality. Then we'll dig into who he says owns and controls the news and the chain of command that makes it all work. After that, we'll see how this system sets the public agenda, which will bring us to the really big question at the end. Is the press actually free? All right, let's get into section 1, Inventing a Reality. This is it. This is the core thesis of the whole book. This idea that the news we get isn't just a mirror reflecting the world, but it's actually a constructed version of it. Parenti kicks things off with a pretty challenging claim. He says that when the media gets things wrong or presents a biased picture, it's not just a mistake or a one-off accident. No, he argues these distortions are repeatable, they're predictable, they're a systemic feature that's literally built into the economic and ideological DNA of the news industry itself. And you can see his mission statement right here, in his own words. He's not really interested in comparing the American press to media in other countries. What he is interested in is measuring it against its own promises. The promise to be this independent, objective watchdog. And his goal is to show that when it comes to the biggest, most important issues, the media structurally just can't live up to those claims. So that brings us to the next piece of the puzzle. If the media isn't what it says it is, then where do you start to figure out what it is? Well, for Parenti, it all begins with a really fundamental question. Who actually owns the news, and why in the world does that matter so much? Parenti actually grounds his analysis in this classic idea, and the logic is pretty straightforward. If a small group of people owns the country's factories, its resources, all the material stuff, well, it kind of follows that they'd also have the upper hand when it comes to controlling the institutions that produce ideas, like schools and, of course, the mass media. And this sets up a huge conflict in how we think about the media. On the one hand, you have the ideal version, right? The one we learn about in school. The press is a public watchdog, it's neutral, it's a platform for everybody. But Parenti argues for a totally different role. He says the media is, first and foremost, a big business. And beyond just making a profit, it works as an institution of ideological control. That is, in his words, class-dominated. So Parenti argues this class-dominated media is playing a two-part game. The first part is simple, make money. But the second part, he claims, is ideological. Its job is to make the existing political and economic system seem legitimate and natural. And the secret to doing that, he suggests, is to always maintain the appearance of being neutral and independent, even when you're structurally tied to the very powerful interests you're supposed to be investigating. Okay, so let's say you're following Parenti's logic so far. The next question has to be, how does this control actually work? I mean, it's not like there's some secret memo going out every day telling reporters what to write, right? Well, let's look at the chain of command he lays out. Parenti uses this idea to make a really sharp point. He says that when we hear freedom of the press, we often think it means freedom for journalists. But in practice, he argues, it really just means freedom for the person who owns the press. It's treated less like a political right for everyone and more like a property right for owners to decide what their company publishes. So he describes his hierarchy, and it probably looks familiar. At the very top, you've got the owners. They have the final say. They hire the executives to run the business. Those executives then manage the producers and editors, who are the daily gatekeepers of the news. And way down at the bottom, you have the journalists. In this model, they aren't rogue agents. They're employees who have to work within the lines drawn by the people above them. Now, Parenti really emphasizes that this control isn't usually some heavy-handed censorship. It's way more subtle. It's the power to hire people who share your worldview and to fire those who don't. It's the power to promote reporters who deliver the right kind of stories. It's the quiet pressure from advertisers. And maybe the most powerful tool of all is what he calls anticipatory self-censorship. That's when journalists just learn over time which stories get a green light and which ones will get them in trouble. So they start censoring themselves before an editor ever has to. So what's the actual result of all this? What's the real-world impact of this ownership structure and these subtle controls? Well, according to Parenti,
One of the biggest consequences is the media's incredible power to set the entire public agenda.
This right here is probably the most famous idea to come out of inventing reality. The argument is that the media's greatest power isn't forcing you to believe something. No, it's telling you what topics are worth thinking about in the first place. By deciding what gets front-page coverage and what gets buried or ignored, they basically define what our society treats as important.
This concept has a name. It's called agenda setting. Parenti argues that by constantly emphasizing certain things, like, say, street crime, while downplaying or ignoring others, like corporate crime, the media organizes our whole political universe. They draw the map and set the boundaries for what even counts as a legitimate topic for public conversation.
And here's a related concept he calls opinion visibility. This is the idea that the media can create the illusion of a public consensus. Think about it. By constantly having guests on who all share one point of view, and by marginalizing or mocking other views, they can create a media image of what the public thinks that might be totally different from what people actually believe. So what kind of news do we get out of a system like this? Well, Parenti argues it leads to a very specific set of biases. Coverage tends to focus on a politician's personality instead of the actual issues. It focuses on a single event, like a protest, instead of the systemic problems that caused it. Official government sources get quoted way more than regular people with grievances. And you see a lot of focus on the sensational and the weird, while the common, everyday systemic problems just don't get much airtime. And all of this, everything we've walked through, brings us to our final section, and the ultimate question that Parenti's book forces us to ask. When you take all of this into account, can we honestly say that the press is free? And Parenti is quick to point out that he's not the first person to worry about this. He actually cites the Hutchins Commission, which was a huge study on press freedom all the way back in 1947. And even then, they concluded that it's the owners and managers who are the ultimate gatekeepers. They're the ones who decide which people, which facts, and which ideas get a ticket to the public stage. So this is where Parenti lands. His final conclusion is that the press is not the independent institution it claims to be. Instead, he argues it's an institution tied by, as he puts it, purchase and persuasion, that is, by direct ownership and by a shared worldview, to wealthy corporate and political interests. And that's our look at the core arguments of inventing reality. Now, the book doesn't offer a lot of easy answers, but what it does do is leave us with a really powerful set of questions. It's not about whether you agree or disagree with every single point Parenti makes. It's about how this critique might just change the way you consume information. So when you turn on the news or scroll through your feed tomorrow, what new questions might you ask? What kinds of things will you be looking for? And that's really something to think about.